Is my mic working now? Hello, everyone. I told Jocelyn I was surprised to see him here because I thought he was taking down a government today. I guess that's about 2 hours from now. I guess we'll see how that goes.
Well, Premier Smith, it's a huge honor for me to interview you today, and I've divided our talk into 4 sections. So the first section is, let's get to know Premier Danielle Smith. So you ready to get right to it?
Sure, let's get to it.
Okay, the first question everybody wants to know about a politician is, what drove you into politics?
There's a couple things. I was thinking about the answer to that. I told a story about when I became politically aware was when I was in grade 8, and I had a social studies teacher named Mr. McCarthy, and he was teaching us about communism. And I came home talking to Dad at the dinner table. So, my teacher thinks that communism is just great. Well, of course, Dad didn't think much of that, and went to the teacher and gave them what for. Because he's got Ukrainian heritage and didn't think much of what Stalin did to the Ukrainians in the Holodomor. So that's when he realized we needed to get more active talking around the dinner table. And so we did. I didn't get, and I guess maybe no surprise, social studies became my least favorite topic, my least favorite subject. I didn't get back into it until I went into university. And even then, I'm sure some of the folks in the room who are in university political science classes having socialist teachers have this experience. I remember doing a paper comparing the NDP to Marxism, because they at the time talked about nationalizing the banks and abolishing private property. I said, they're actually no different than the Marxists. And so my socialist teacher gave me a C- on that. And she said she didn't like the fact that I quoted the Alberta report because it wasn't a academic source. So that was sort of round number 2. But I wasn't able to vote until 1992, because I was only 17 when in 1988. And so I think that was when I realized, because I've got to vote, I better get involved. And I was fortunate to have a progressive conservative club on campus at the time. There was also a Reform Party club on campus at the time, Liberals and NDs. We had one big club's office room. And maybe this isn't an experience that most young people have today either, unfortunately. We all had really good friendships, even though it was cross-partisan. And so I think that really stuck with me, is that you could have robust disagreements, but you could still then be friends afterwards. So that's sort of how I've conducted myself in politics since. But that was the exciting year because it was a leadership race where we elected Ralph Klein as leader of the provincial party in Alberta. There was a federal leadership race. I was a Jean Charest delegate. Kim Campbell won that one. There was a referendum on Charlottetown, and then a provincial and federal election, all crammed into about 14 months. So when you have that much election experience, you kind of get hooked, and it pulls you back in. So that was where I got my start.
Great. So let's talk about the biggest challenge that you've overcome in your life. So it can be in your political life, it can be in your personal life. Tell us about that.
Well, I was a social pariah in Alberta for about 7 years. I made a very unpopular decision, some of you may recall, in 2014. And it came from, I thought, a good place. I knew that in Alberta I was seeing that when you split the vote, when conservatives split the votes, the left ends up winning. And so I think what had occurred, there had been so much turmoil and change in the PC party. Jim Prentice, who was, I think, a very well-respected cabinet minister at the federal level, came back to try one last time to save the PC party. I had great admiration for Jim, and we thought maybe we could do sort of a quick merger of the two parties, get the membership validated afterwards, and everything would be great. And it didn't turn out that way, of course. I lost my seat. I lost my nomination, and the government was defeated. And we ended up with 4 years of NDP government with the exact thing I was wanting to avoid. The exact thing I was wanting to avoid was the left being able to take control of our province. And so I was delighted when Premier Kenney came back, and he and Brian Jean laid down arms, brought the two parties together the right way, and was able to have a chance to come back into politics. It wasn't easy, though, because when I got kicked out of public life, I decided not to leave it and went on to talk radio. And I can tell you the blue streak that people texted into me for probably the first 3 months on there, it was a little bit unpleasant. And it was for about 3 years that I didn't go to events like this, because all of my dearest friends who I'd go up and give the hug to, they would give me the hand or walk away. So it took a long time for me to to make amends for that mistake. But I figured that once the opening came into politics one more time, as you know, those of you who are in politics, it just, once you think you're out, it just pulls you back in. And someone had gotten me, I think it was the Western Standard, had gotten me to commit that if the job came open, I'd run for it. So I thought, I'm hooked now. And so I put my name forward, and here I am. Surprisingly, the Conservatives can be very forgiving, and I think we're doing some great things together in Alberta.
So. So I think we'd all love to know what your biggest political accomplishment has been year to date.
This may be surprising to you, but it's the work that we've done on healthcare reform. I got into, and when I first got elected, you have to remember the environment that I was entering into. The left was screaming that the system was going to collapse, that we were in an emergency, a crisis, it was going to fall apart. In fact, we've been hearing that, I think, in every province now for the last 2.5 years, that the system is completely incapable of managing surge. And we have now had in this fall session, so here we were after 2 waves of COVID, and we had a health system that was still unable to manage surge. And now we had RSV and influenza and COVID all hitting at once. And we saw what happened when the health bureaucrats said we couldn't handle it. They shut down the economy, they put on masks, they put on restrictions, and I thought, we're not gonna let that happen. So I fired the entire CMOH, because I felt like, they just weren't up to giving me the advice that I needed. And I also replaced the Board of Alberta Health Services. And the reason I did that is because we do this a lot in politics. When politicians want to shield themselves from the fallout of mistakes, it's, well, let's set up a separate agency with a separate board and a separate decision-making model. So when something goes wrong, you say, that's not my fault, that's their fault. But we were going to get blamed for healthcare anyway. So I figured may as well put an official administrator in there so I can call them and direct them and reach in and actually make some changes. And I'll tell you what the biggest surprise for me is that the civil service, when they have clear direction and they see that there's alignment with their direct boss and the minister responsible and the premier, and you give them clear goals and you measure them and you know that you're going to chop off a few heads if they don't achieve results, they achieve results. And so I can tell you where we're at today. We did a 90-day report, and one of the things that we were experiencing, I'm sure it happens in other communities, but there's this system that has emerged where ambulances have become almost an extension of hallway medicine. So all of the acute care beds are jammed up because we're not efficiently moving patients into long-term care, which jams up the hallways. And then when the hallways jam up, they just keep patients in the back of ambulances. And there are some times where you end up with a backlog of 15 ambulances sitting there, sometimes for an entire shift. And I have a dear friend who's a paramedic. He told me, I asked him what the worst situation was. And he said that he ended up having to have not only his entire shift there, but then he was relieved by the second crew coming in babysitting that same patient because there wasn't effective offload. And then the times that I was hearing people spending in the emergency room, up to 29 hours, people laying on the floor because there wasn't additional space for them to go in. And also the surgical backlog. We had gotten, we were doing not a bad job of clearing the surgical backlog that resulted from COVID, but we have way too many patients that are waiting longer than medically reasonable. Right now, we pinned the mark on that at about 39,000 patients. So we set those targets: reduce surgical wait times, improve the flow through emergency, and have an efficient ambulance drop-off. And when in our 90-day report, and I can tell you it's probably going to be the case at the end of this month, that every paramedic who comes to drop off a patient will be able to drop them off, clean their gear, and leave and get on the road within 45 minutes. We're almost at that target. And the way we were able to do it was that we identified the 16 acute care facilities that were having the problem, and we hired dedicated nursing staff to be able to do the onboarding. It required us to hire 114 full-time equivalents. And then on top, and so I'll tell you what happens. I can give you an example because I checked in with my paramedic friend, and I asked him how things were going. And maybe not so well for him personally, because he used to be able to do overtime at will because there were already all these overtime shifts available. He says now it's pretty slim pickings for overtime shifts because, and I said, well, have you been parked yet? Because he has had a lot of acute patients he's taken, and since most of them, understandably, have been a quick turnaround. But he got parked one day last week, just in giving a routine transfer. And I said, well, what happened there? He said, well, we got parked, and then the supervisor came along and said, what are you doing here? You're not supposed to be here. And they quickly jumped into action so that they could offload the patient and get the paramedic out again. And so that is how the system should work. And that is what is remarkable to me, is that didn't require extra resources. It just required applying some business sense, some sort of process steps that you will go through in business to try to isolate the problem, identify the solutions, and step by step solve them. And I should say one more thing, because the left is having this big battle. I watch it with Jagmeet Singh, and he's the boss of Rachel Notley, because you know how these NDP parties work, right? That the provincial party becomes the wing, the local wing of the federal party. And so when I hear that Jagmeet Singh wants to make health transfers conditional on us shutting down our private surgical centers that are performing publicly paid services, I'll tell you the impact that would have. Right now, so we're in I mentioned to you that we had a backlog of medically, of surgeries outside the medically recommended period of 39,000. Already we've whittled that down to 35,000. So new patients are coming in, but we are clearing that backlog faster, so we're reducing it. Dr. John, who's my official administrator, says at this rate, we will have cleared the surgical backlog of people waiting longer than medically recommended within 12 months. And I think we'll be the first province to be able to do that. But part of the way we're doing that is with chartered surgical centers. We can do 300,000 surgeries a year. 60,000 of them are being done in chartered surgical centers because they can develop efficient ways of getting patients through so they can do more surgeries. That is going to be key. If we shut that down and took 20% of our surgical capacity out of the system, our waiting list would go up again. One more thing I will just say, I'm sorry, I could talk all day about this, as you can probably tell, but one more thing that you'll find with chartered surgical centers, if it becomes controversial in your area, is that I think we've become accustomed to seeing hospital builds that start off as $1 billion project, and then by the time they're done, they become a $2 or $3 or $4 or $5 billion project. Well, one of the chartered surgical centers that we've contracted with, we pay nothing for their capital build out, because they're just happy having a long-term contract. They amortize that. They're able to take their long-term contract to the bank, and they're able to get private bank financing. So that's one reason why you want to use charter surgical centers, is you can massively expand capacity without having to spend a huge amount of additional capital dollars to do it. But I even went and toured this facility, which can now do 8,500 surgeries. And the doc there said, all of our hospitals are designed wrong. So he wanted to design one right, got his brother there. And one of the things that they do is that they have all of the operating bays on the outside and the sterilized equipment and gauze and whatever else that they need on the inside. So anytime somebody needs to get something, it's very convenient to get to. Ta-da! Wouldn't that be a smart thing to have in all of our hospitals? But I did ask him, so how much did this cost you? Because it was an amazing facility. And he told me it was $25 million with an M. So those are the kind of things that we need to, as conservatives, be proud of. We run away from healthcare, and we should run towards it. Because part of the reason why healthcare doesn't work is it's being operated in this sort of top-down, only one way to deliver, public-funded, publicly delivered, but we can have private delivery, public funding, stay within the Canada Health Act, and bring all of the principles that we know work in free enterprise to this most expensive service. So that's what we're doing in Alberta.
Now that's a great accomplishment. So Section 2, we're going to focus on the media in Canada, and I've got a clip that they're going to play. I'm sure most of you have seen this clip before. Oh.
I've never been to one of their events, and I look at Pierre Poilievre saying that he doesn't intend to go to their events and doesn't intend to have his ministers involved in them either. And I take the same view.
But why? You're still not explaining what your views are on the World Economic Forum. Like, what do you find distasteful about it?
I guess I find it distasteful when billionaires brag about how much control they have over political leaders, as the head of that organization has. And I think that that is offensive. The people who should be directing government are the people who vote for them. And the people who vote for me and for my colleagues are people who live in Alberta and who are affected by our decisions. And so, quite frankly, until that organization stops bragging about how much control they have over political leaders, I have no interest in being involved with them. My focus is here in Alberta, solving problems for Albertans with the mandate from Albertans.
So I saw that clip. So I watched that clip and I thought, wow, that's how you handle the media. So let's talk about how do you get your message out to Canadians when we have such a biased media?
Having a biased media is not new. I sometimes make this point because I was a Herald editorial writer in the late 90s, and I had an assignment to go up and cover the legislature, and Ralph Klein was still there, and he used to do this weekly Q&A, just open bear pit session with the media. And I remember being shocked because one of the first questions came from the CBC, and he didn't like it, and he just said to the guy, "What a stupid question. I've never seen such a dumb question." And he just sort of went on about that for a couple of minutes, and sort of sent a message to the rest of the gallery, "Ooh, I don't want to ask the next stupid question." But Klein used to have, I always say it, I never look up what he talked about the 5 fives of journalism, chaos, confusion, conflict, and so on. And so it's always been that way. And so I didn't expect it really to be any different when I got in. I know that the media has a job to do. I wish they would go back to being fair, accurate, and balanced, which is what I was taught journalism was supposed to be. I don't see a heck of a lot of that out there in journalism these days, unfortunately. But the good news is that I think that we're beginning to see a large number of alternative media that has sprouted off on both the left and the right. I mean, you've got Canada Lands and Tyee and Observer on the left, and you've got Western Standard and Rebel and Counter Signal and other. I mean,
and the News Forum,
News Forum, and True North. I mean, I could probably go on and on about all the ones on the right as well. And so I think that is allowing for really journalism to be what it should be, and it's creating a business model that I think is going to work, because the business model in mainstream media is offer content for free and then go to big advertisers to sell those eyes. But guess what happens is that then if advertisers get squeamish because of a commentary or line of questioning, they pull their funding, then all of a sudden that shuts down the conversation in media. That's what we've gotten into in this world, where everybody is terrified of saying one false word because it could end up canceling you. Is the corporations who are advertising in mainstream media, they get boycott campaigns, and they get Twitter bombed too, and they don't have a tolerance for that. But the model that I'm seeing in alt media, which is small advertising that's more localized for small businesses, but also the subscriber model is far more robust. I think that really is, I can imagine years from now that many of the big names that we see in mainstream media won't exist, but some of the alt names that we just talked about are going to be elevated to being the more prominent news sources. So I still do both. I will still do mainstream media, understanding they have the job to do, but I also will do alternative media as well. And we also have our own channels that we push out. I have, from time to time, I'll do my own direct podcasting. We do videos. We have a robust social media on all of the channels. I've asked all my ministers and all my MLAs to be there as well so that they can push it out. And we do also our own advertising. So we've got both of our caucus and our campaign is doing advertising on our key messages. So that to me is how I don't look at the media as the way to carry our message. I just think, and I don't think we should as conservatives. It's not the media's job to carry our message. It is our job to find a way to break through. We have to be, I think, respectful, because there's still so many people who use that as their main news source. So we have to be present there. But if we want to get a positive story out about us, we have to do it ourselves.
So I want to shift focus. You're in the middle of an election campaign. Let's talk about the Alberta provincial election and what your vision is for the province.
Well, first, let me say that we've done pretty well over the past number of months. I think people were a bit surprised. I think there's a funny editorial cartoon that has the UCP walking along and Rachel Notley, or no, it has Rachel Notley walking around and a UCP hand coming out of the grave to grab her foot, which I think gives you an idea of where people felt we were back in October. And we did lose a lot of our base. I think that we did have the movement splitting again. Is why I ended up coming back in. So almost all last year, we were polling behind the NDP, and slowly but surely, despite the relentlessly negative news coverage that I seem to garner, we ended up increasing in the polls. So even one of the more balanced pollster, maybe more on the progressive side, he's got a poll out today that really has us and the NDP neck and neck. So the good news is that we're finally united as a conservative movement. Now we just have to gain a little bit more ground in Calgary and in Edmonton. And I would say this because this is a challenge for all conservatives, is we have to figure out how to win in big cities, because increasingly people are moving to big cities. And I understand completely why rural Alberta loves us, because our values resonate so well with rural Alberta. We believe in individual freedom and also strong families and multi-generational families, often working a family business, often a family farm. A lot of people are involved in their faith community. Their faith community does a lot of good works in the community. So you've got free enterprise. And then when people do really well, they also give back to their community with philanthropy. Like, that is the full conservative vision, and it's played out every single day in rural Alberta. Now, when you get to larger cities, there's a few more disconnects. The families are not necessarily all together in the same city, and you don't necessarily have generational and family businesses, and you don't necessarily have people who even know their neighbors, let alone getting involved in community groups. So it's a very different challenge in how you talk to an urban audience. So I can tell you, I'm a pretty known quantity as my conservative libertarian views, since I've been in the public for a long time. But a lot of the vision that we're putting forward is one where we don't just focus on the dollars and cents. I have felt like conservatives say, vote for me and I will cut your taxes, cut your regulation, cut your spending. And we don't really have a vision for what it is that we're going to do with all of those dollars that get generated from taxes, other than just hand it over to the same people that the guys on the left hired. And why would we think that we would get conservative policy if we do that? I think what we really need to do is to develop a vision for how we apply our conservative values to the delivery of public services. So I already explained how I would do that in healthcare, but we will do that. I think we mentioned earlier about the Jocelyn mentioned earlier about the Alberta model for our recovery-oriented system of care, and I want to just give this as another example so that you can see the kind of things that we're doing in Alberta. We know that our people love the law and order talk, but you can't lead with law and order when you've got people who are struggling with mental health and addiction. And we've got a very serious mental health and addiction crisis. Fentanyl is an awful, awful drug. It kills quickly, and it kills so many young people in a way that I haven't seen a drug do before. And carfentanil is even worse. One little grain of the size of salt can kill you instantly. But that's what we've got on our streets in Calgary and Edmonton, and it is just devastating. We've seen a massive increase in opioid deaths, opioid overdoses, and also pressure on our hospitals. But so this is what we've done. This recovery-oriented system of care that my Chief of Staff, Marshall Smith, has pioneered, it takes the view that we don't give up on people. We believe it's our job to try to get them their individual agency back. And so if we can get their individual agency back, then they can go on to reconnecting with family and friends and get on to living a productive life. So our very first recovery community opened up in Red Deer. And it's going to be modeled on it's almost like a dormitory. I've gone and visited it. We've got 50 male beds on one side and 25 female beds on the other, separate kitchens. And it's going to be working therapy. People are going to go and they'll do therapy in the morning and chores in the afternoon, or vice versa. They'll learn to cook and shop and do gardening and and learn basic skills. And whether it's a month or 6 months or a year, when they come out, they're going to be recovered. They're going to have a job. They're going to have a community wrapped around them. That, to me, is what success looks like from a conservative applied model compared to what you see up and down the West Coast, the carnage there. I saw Seattle is dying a few years ago. Vancouver is dying. Aaron Gunn has done an amazing video on that. And yeah, I think he's here. And so when I see that that's what the left's model is, it's giving up on people. It's safe consumption, now safe supply. It's not pushing people to get their lives back. So we're going to take a different approach. And then on the other hand, we're also going to not tolerate public disorder. We have to give respect back to our law enforcement. We have to make sure that people do respect law enforcement. And we know that our law enforcement is there to keep us safe and to make sure that we don't have to cross a doorway and inhale secondhand crystal meth smoke. So that's sort of a combination of what we're doing. But generally, so I wanted to just explain that other model to you so that you know that in Alberta we are doing an approach where we're applying our conservative values to the delivery of government services. And we believe that because we can do that with free enterprise, with individual choice, with accountability, we believe that that's going to result in better public services, which will allow for us to create a vision that I think will be a lot more compelling to those who live in Calgary and Edmonton, who look to see, what are you going to do as government? How are you going to solve my problems in healthcare and education and social services? And I think we've really embarked on that. More broadly, what I want to see Alberta be is just this beacon that's going to attract people from all over the province and all over the world. We had 13 consecutive quarters of people leaving our province under the NDP. That should tell you something. 183,000 jobs lost. We are now getting record numbers of people returning to Alberta. And what I would love to see, because I noticed that Quebec's population is stagnating, I'm going forward to 30 years to a time where Alberta will be the second largest province with the second largest economy, second most populous. We'll actually have some power in Confederation. So that's where we're heading.
Great vision, a great vision for the province. Now let's talk about what you think is the biggest threat to your province right now.
The biggest threat is this NDP Liberal coalition in Ottawa, and an ideological prime minister who is who has a very hard time understanding that he cannot just issue edicts and have them happen in the real world. We live in a world where we have to have policy that makes sense. And I can tell you, because we did pass the Alberta Sovereignty Within the United Canada Act. The Eastern media didn't seem to like it that much, but we felt it was important to educate our federal counterparts about how our country is supposed to work. We are not a unitary state. We do not pass our laws in our province with the consent of Justin Trudeau. We pass them with the consent of the King. We have a direct sovereign relationship with the monarch, and there's a reason for that. It's because when we were established as a country, we decided that there's certain powers that belong to the federal government and there's certain powers that belong to the provincial government. It's true. So you won't see me saying, gee, I'm going to create my own currency. You don't see me saying, oh, I'm going to set up passport offices, although I'm pretty sure I do a better job of managing that. Or taking over the management of the airports for all of you who've had the misery of going through Pearson. Because it would be absurd, wouldn't it? It'd be absurd for a provincial premier to dare to think that she could step in and take over federal power. It's equally absurd for the federal government to think that they can come in and tell our province how to manage our resources and how to manage our electricity and whether we should be able to build highways and whether we should be able to build power plants. That's what their Bill C-69 did. That's what this new environmental approval process has done. It's not just about interprovincial pipelines, which I recognize as federal jurisdiction. They're controlling all of the development within the borders of every province. This is why 8 provinces are on board with us in arguing against it in the Supreme Court this week. And so this is very existential for us, because I can tell you what they want to do next. Having put that legislation in place and asserted that they have the power to pass pretty well whatever they want, they now want to put a cap on emissions on our oil and natural gas sector to reduce emissions 42% by 2030. That's 7 years from now. I can tell you it is impossible. That cannot happen without shutting in production. An emissions cap like that is a production cap, and it's a violation of our Constitution. They've talked about putting a cap on emissions for fertilizer, reducing that by 30% by 2030. That would reduce food production at a time that we've got a global food security crisis. And they also want to prevent us from putting more natural gas on our power grid. We're a natural gas basin in Alberta. It makes sense for us to heat our homes with natural gas. It makes sense for us to have gas stoves. It makes sense for us to have electricity that is powered by natural gas, and 90% of it is. The federal government wants to stop us from doing that. We had grid instability this winter. And the reason we had grid instability this winter is because everybody has been so enthusiastic about building out solar and wind. We've got 5,000 megawatts of installed solar and wind power. And on 2 days in Alberta, it was producing 100 megawatts of electricity. We can't keep on doing this. You can't build out that amount of capacity if it's only going to be operating at a fraction of what you need when you need it most. So that's what the federal government's vision is for Alberta, is that we're going to be operating on unreliable energy that is increasingly unaffordable. And that is crushing to our economy. So when you ask what the biggest threat is, it's the clean electricity regs, it's the emissions caps that we might see on fertilizer and oil and natural gas. And we're in deep conversation with the federal government so that they know our position. And I should say that it's not because we're operating in opposition to this long-term aspiration of carbon neutrality by 2050. We just think we can reach carbon neutrality a different way. If we export our LNG, that reduces emissions of more polluting fuels elsewhere. And that's one way that we think we would be able to reduce our emissions. We believe carbon capture, utilization, and storage will ultimately help us to capture and bury or embed it into useful products. We believe that we will be able to use natural gas as a precursor to potentially a hydrogen economy at some point. We've got hydrogen construction happening in our province. Geothermal is also a potential. Small modular nuclear is going to come on stream in Ontario and New Brunswick. I'm watching that with great interest. I'd love to see that. So those are the things that make sense for our economy, and those are the things we could work constructively with the federal government on. But when you have an ideological government that wants to achieve unrealistic targets as quickly as they do, it's just, we're on a collision course. And so you're going to see the first of that in the courts this week. But we're really hoping that we're able to convince them to back off.
Now, you mentioned a little bit about Alberta's role in Canada and the importance of the resource sector. And I know that we're going to be coming close to our time, but I have a couple of questions that I want to get in really quickly. U.S. President Joe Biden is arriving for a visit with Justin Trudeau. And despite Biden's pledge to end fossil fuels in the United States, the U.S. is quickly becoming a world leader in exporting liquefied natural gas, and yet our federal government continues to obstruct our resource sector. Your thoughts on this? What can we do to get our resources to market?
Well, I think, and you're very right about the effort that the Americans are making. I just heard that they've approved something in the order of a project that will ultimately result in 20 BCF a day being exported. The project, just to give you a comparison, on the coast that Shell is doing with LNG Canada, I believe is 2 BCF on its first, and then it will expand another 2 if they can get the second 2 facilities built. And I think Cedar is also a new one that was approved by British Columbia, and that's another 1.5. So we are only a fraction of where the U.S. is going. But there is an opportunity to do so much more. I've been pleasantly surprised. This is the nice part about being involved in these COF meetings, these Council of the Federation, is you realize all of the premiers have the same view about Ottawa. They just believe that they're just digging into our turf way too much, and that includes British Columbia. They want to develop natural gas. They want to figure out a way to do it that works within their emissions cap. But I think that with the kind of things that I've been talking about how you decarbonize on the electricity side, we're able to do that. So that's one thing, is we're working in partnership with British Columbia so that we can make a joint effort to say that we need to be pushing forward on this. The other thing that we're doing is I've got a Minister of Transportation and Economic Corridors. And so we're looking for a coalition of the willing to start building out economic corridors, because I think I'll tell you the difference between the way we currently try to build infrastructure versus what an economic corridor would do. The way we currently do it is we tell a proponent, oh, you want to build a pipeline? Good luck with that. And then the proponent goes on out and has to deal with all of the landowners, all the First Nations, all of the municipalities, all of the different provincial governments, the federal government, multiple regulatory processes, environmental groups, and then 10 years later gets told after $1 billion spent, sorry, we don't think that this has a business case. The alternative would be is if we got our act together as provinces and with our First Nations and let our First Nations lead the route in identifying where the go zone should be for corridors and having joint ownership over it so that we could identify the areas that have historic value, that have religious value, that have environmental value. And then once you've established those corridors, then you go out to the proponent and say, okay, you come and build, you can build here. And so we're looking at developing corridors from Fort McMurray through Saskatchewan, Manitoba to Churchill. There's a potential for us to bring one up in Ontario to James Bay. There's also another option potentially to go down on an existing corridor to get to Thunder Bay so we can get out to the Great Lakes. Potential to go up to Tuktoyaktuk in the north, maybe over to Port of Prince Rupert through the northern part of British Columbia. And then the Premier of Yukon is pretty excited about what was an A to A proposal following the Alaska Highway that would allow us to build not only a rail line but also other infrastructure going out through where was that? Through Valdez. So those are the things that we're working on, is identifying 4 or 5 or 6 different routes that we can take, and then just be saying we're open for business. And then that'll put us in a bit of a collision course, I think, potentially with the federal government. But I'm prepared to have that fight. I'm prepared to argue. Yeah. Because we have some incredible First Nations leaders, Indian Resource Council and the Coalition of Chiefs. And one of the arguments that they've made to me is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples also gives our Indigenous peoples the rights to develop resources. It's not just about saying no. And so if we have Indigenous-led projects to be able to get Indigenous resources and to market, and we're able to partner with them, I think that's going to put a really interesting challenge to the courts. I kind of would dare them to say no to something like that in a world where we're addressing the environmental issues and we're providing food security and energy security to the world. I think that that's a scrap worth having.
Well, we could talk all day. There's so many topics. Our time has come to a close. I wish we had more time. I had many more questions I just couldn't get to. So thank you to Premier Danielle Smith for taking the time to be with us.